The story began not with flashing lights or dramatic arrests, but with paperwork, quiet requests, property records pulled from archives that hadn't been touched in decades. What first drew attention was not suspicion, but inconsistency. Blueprints for the Brentwood estate showed something that did not align with a visible structure above ground. Measurements that stopped abruptly, a corridor line that ended where solid earth should have been. At first, it looked like a drafting error, the kind that happens when homes are renovated repeatedly over many years. But when surveyors returned with modern scanning equipment, the readings did not correct the mistake. They deepened it. What lay beneath the mansion was not a single crawl space or forgotten utility duct. It was a passage, narrow, reinforced, intentionally concealed. And according to officials familiar with the review, its existence had never been formally documented in any recent ownership filings. That absence is what triggered federal attention. Not because tunnels are illegal, but because undocumented subterranean structures raise questions about safety, zoning, and in rare cases, historical usage tied to older federal investigations. When agents were finally authorized to enter the underground space, expectations were low. Most assumed it would lead to an abandoned storage room, perhaps an old wine cellar expanded without permits. What they encountered instead forced everyone involved to recalibrate. The tunnel extended farther than anticipated, curving beneath the property line and branching at a junction reinforced with steel beams that dated back several decades. The air was stale, but not ancient. This was not a relic sealed off by time. It had been accessed, maintained, and deliberately kept out of sight. As they moved deeper, lighting revealed markings along the walls. Not graffiti, not symbols, but measurements. Handwritten notations. Dates. Some faded, others surprisingly clear. The tunnel did not feel improvised. It felt planned. That realization changed the tone immediately. Investigators slowed their pace, documenting every inch, aware now that whatever this was, it had been built with purpose. Inside a recessed chamber off the main passage, they found objects that did not belong underground. Furniture, carefully wrapped. Boxes labeled with handwriting that did not match any known contractor records. One container held film reels sealed in protective casing. Another contained journals. Not diaries in the personal sense, but logs. Schedules. Notes about meetings that reference locations above ground, but times that did not align with public records. None of it was illegal on its face, but all of it was unexpected. What caused visible unease was not a single item, but the pattern they formed together. The tunnel was not just a hiding place. It was a connector, a space designed for movement, storage, and privacy, operating parallel to a life that appeared fully transparent above ground. That contrast unsettled even seasoned agents. People are accustomed to secrets in Hollywood. They're not accustomed to infrastructure built to support them. That at no point did investigators suggest criminal intent tied directly to Rob Reiner himself. In fact, early assessments emphasized that the tunnel appeared to predate his ownership of the property. But the discovery raised unavoidable questions about what the space had been used for and why it had remained hidden through multiple transfers of ownership without surfacing in inspections. Someone at some point had ensured it stayed that way. As word of the discovery spread internally, comparisons surfaced. Old Cold War-era safe routes. Private passages used by high-profile figures for discreet movement during periods of intense scrutiny. None of those theories were confirmed, but they framed the inquiry. The goal was no longer to explain a construction anomaly. It was to understand a system. What agents reportedly found most unsettling was the final chamber. Smaller than the others. Windowless. Sound-dampened. Inside were chairs arranged, facing a blank wall. No screen. No decoration. Just space. Purposeful emptiness. The kind that suggests listening more than watching. Nothing in that room was inherently threatening. Yet everyone who entered described the same reaction. A sudden drop in temperature. A feeling that the room had been used, then abandoned. Without explanation, that'd be why the time agents emerged back into daylight. The tone had shifted entirely. This was no longer a footnote. It was an unresolved narrative buried beneath a public life that had seemed well documented. No conclusions were drawn, no accusations made, but files were expanded, historians were consulted, property histories reopened. The tunnel did not rewrite Rob Reiner's story, but it complicated the assumption that every story is visible from the surface. And as investigators closed the access point behind them, one thing was certain. Whatever had once moved through that hidden passage was never meant to be seen. The moment federal engineers sealed the entrance again, the focus shifted from discovery to context. Investigators understood that tunnels, especially in older Los Angeles estates, were not unheard of. What made this one different was not its existence, but its precision. Someone had invested time, money, and discretion to ensure it remained invisible while still functional. That combination demanded explanation. Archival research began immediately. Property deeds from the mid-20th century revealed a pattern common to the area during certain eras. Several nearby estates, long since renovated or demolished, had once included subterranean expansions. These are not criminal by default. Some were built during periods of heightened security concerns, others for privacy in a city where attention could become intrusive. The problem was that most of those tunnels have been documented, inspected, and eventually disclosed. This one had slipped through. When historians were consulted, they cautioned against sensational conclusions. Los Angeles in the post-war years was a city shaped by fear as much as ambition. Earthquake anxiety, celebrity stalking, political paranoia, and even organized crime concerns had all contributed to unconventional architectural decisions. The tunnel under the Reiner estate fit the physical profile of several known but poorly documented builds from that era. What complicated matters further was the timeline. Materials used in the structure suggested multiple phases of construction. Some reinforcements dated back several decades. Others were newer, carefully integrated without leaving obvious surface disruption. This indicated maintenance, not neglect. Someone had ensured the tunnel remained safe to use long after its original purpose may have passed. Agents reviewing the journals found inside the chamber approached them with restraint. The entries did not describe illegal acts. Instead, they recorded meetings, conversations, and movements in a coded shorthand that resisted easy interpretation. Names were abbreviated. Locations were referenced obliquely. It read less like a confession and more like a personal system for tracking sensitive interactions. Without context, the material meant little. With context, it raised questions. Crucially, no evidence connected these materials directly to Rob Reiner's professional or personal activities. Investigators were careful to emphasize this point internally. The property had changed hands. Lives overlapped spaces without inheriting their secrets. The tunnel appeared to be one such inheritance, a remnant of someone else's precautions. Still, the discovery forced a reconsideration of assumptions about transparency. Above ground, Rob Reiner's life had been visible, vocal, and often scrutinized. Below ground existed a space defined by the opposite values: silence, concealment, control. That contrast captured attention not because it suggested wrongdoing, but because it underscored how little physical spaces reveal about their pasts. As experts analyzed the furniture found inside, they noted its placement was deliberate. Chairs aligned for conversation rather than comfort. Notables. No decorative elements. The room was not designed for leisure. It was designed for exchange. That detail mattered. Spaces shape behavior. Whoever built that chamber anticipated dialogue that required privacy and discretion. Soundproofing materials further suggested intent. This was not about hiding objects. It was about containing voices. Engineers confirmed the room would have prevented conversation from being detected above ground. That feature alone explained why the tunnel had remained undetected for so long. Even vibrations were minimized. Speculation inevitably followed. Was a space used by a previous owner with security concerns? Was it connected to a historical event now forgotten? Or was it simply an over-engineered solution to a private problem? Investigators resisted narrowing possibilities prematurely. The absence of criminal indicators allowed the inquiry to remain exploratory rather than accusatory. Public reaction, when the discovery became known, leaned toward imagination. Headlines filled the gap left by facts. Officials pushed back quietly, reminding reporters that unusual architecture does not equal sinister intent. Los Angeles is a city layered with untold stories, many of them mundane once fully understood. What remained undeniable was the emotional impact on those who had walked through the tunnel. Even stripped of speculation, the experience unsettled. There is something instinctively disorienting about realizing that beneath a familiar place lies a second world built to operate unnoticed. It challenges the belief that surfaces tell the whole story. For Rob Reiner's family, the discovery prompted reflection rather than alarm. They cooperated fully, offering access to records and acknowledging that the home, like many in the area, had a long history predating their stewardship. They emphasized that whatever the tunnel's purpose, it did not define a life lived above it. Investigators ultimately agreed. The tunnel was a historical artifact, not a verdict. Its existence invited curiosity, not condemnation. Yet it lingered in the public imagination because it symbolized something broader. The idea that even the most visible lies are layered, that spaces carry memories independent of those who inhabit them later. As the inquiry continued quietly, one conclusion solidified. The tunnel did not expose a secret about Rob Reiner. It exposed a truth about places. They remember more than people realize. They outlast intentions. And sometimes, when uncovered, they remind us that certainty is often built on incomplete maps. As the investigation moved forward, attention turned to the human tendency to fill silence with narrative. Officials noticed that the less they said publicly, the more elaborate the theories became. This was not new, but the tunnel amplified it. Underground spaces invite imagination because they exist outside daily awareness. They feel deliberate, even when they are mundane. Investigators understood this and chose to release information slowly, prioritizing accuracy over reassurance. Behind the scenes, structural engineers conducted a full integrity assessment. Their findings were precise and unsentimental. The tunnel was built to last. Load-bearing supports were placed at regular intervals. Drainage channels prevented moisture accumulation. Ventilation shafts were cleverly disguised within landscaping features above ground. None of this was accidental. It reflected planning, expertise, and resources. Whoever commissioned the work anticipated long-term use. That realization led to a narrower historical window. Building techniques and materials pointed to a period when such construction was fashionable among a small subset of property owners who valued privacy above all else. This was an era when celebrity culture was evolving rapidly, and security concerns often outpaced regulation. Some homeowners built panic rooms. Others built tunnels, not for escape, but for control. Control over movement, over sound, over access. Investigators revisited ownership records with this context in mind. Several previous owners were identified, each with different public profiles and private circumstances. One had faced repeated intrusion from a press. Another had business dealings that required discretion. None were accused of wrongdoing, but all had reasons to value concealment. The tunnel, in this light, began to look less like a secret and more like a solution. The journals found inside remained the most ambiguous element. Linguists were consulted to analyze the shorthand. Patterns emerged. The writing favored compression over clarity, suggesting the author expected to remember context without explanation. Dates corresponded loosely with known events in Los Angeles history, but never aligned cleanly. That misalignment suggested intentional obfuscation rather than poor record keeping. Importantly, the journals ended abruptly. The final pages contained half-finished entries, lines that stopped mid-thought. There was no closing statement, no explanation for abandonment. That absence created a sense of interruption rather than conclusion. Something had changed. Either the need for the tunnel ended, or the person who used it no longer could. Agents also examined the film reels found in the storage area. Preservation experts confirmed they were not commercially released material. They appear to be private recordings, possibly meetings or rehearsals, though no playback equipment was found on site. The reels were transferred to a controlled environment for careful examination, with strict protocols to protect privacy and comply with legal standards. Throughout this process, officials remained cautious in their language. They emphasized repeatedly that discovery does not equal implication. Spaces carry forward the intentions of those who built them, not those who later inhabit them. This distinction mattered, especially as public speculation edged toward assigning meaning based on association rather than evidence. Rob Reiners' name continued to surface in discussions not because of any connection to the tunnel's creation, but because of the contrast it presented. His life had been marked by openness, advocacy, and a willingness to engage publicly. The tunnel represented the opposite impulse. That contrast made the story compelling, but it also risked misunderstanding. Investigators worked to keep those narratives separate. Psychologists consulted on the case offer an observation. Humans are unsettled by hidden spaces because they challenge our sense of control. We prefer environments we can map mentally. Discovering an unknown layer beneath a familiar place destabilizes that map. It reminds us that our understanding is provisional, that discomfort often seeks resolution through story, even when facts are incomplete. As weeks passed, the inquiry narrowed. No criminal indicators emerged. No violations warranted prosecution. The tunnel would be documented, secured, and added to property records. Its mystery would remain, partially resolved, but not fully explained. For investigators, that outcome was acceptable. Not every question demands an answer. Some demand restraint. Public interest gradually softened, though curiosity lingered. The story shifted from alarm to reflection. Articles began to explore the history of hidden architecture in Los Angeles, placing the tunnel within a broader context. It became one example among many rather than a singular anomaly. For those closest to the property, the experience prompted a reevaluation of space. Rooms once taken for granted now felt layered with unseen history. That awareness did not inspire fear. It inspired humility. Places endure beyond the lives lived within them. They collect intentions, anxieties, and solutions that may never be fully understood. In the end, the tunnel did not reveal a secret about Rob Reiner. It revealed something about the city he lived in and about the eras that shaped its architecture. It reminded observers that privacy has always been negotiated through design, not just behavior, and that sometimes what lies beneath the surface is not a revelation, but a record of someone else's need for silence. As the official review entered its later stages, the tunnel's significance began to shift from investigative curiosity to cultural symbol. What had initially unsettled agents now intrigued historians, architects, and sociologists alike. The structure was no longer examined only for what it concealed, but for what it revealed about the era that created it. In that sense, the tunnel became a kind of artifact, not dangerous, but instructive. Experts pointed out that Los Angeles has always been a city of dual realities. Public glamour above ground, private anxieties below it. From hidden speakeasies during Prohibition to private screening rooms and panic bunkers, the city's architecture often mirrors its psychology. The tunnel beneath the Reiner estate fit squarely into that tradition. It was a physical manifestation of the need to disappear without leaving. Architectural historians noted the tunnel's restraint. It was not lavish. It did not attempt to impress. Every choice served function rather than comfort. That restraint suggested urgency rather than indulgence. Whoever built it was not interested in luxury. They were interested in certainty, in knowing there was a place where noise could not travel and eyes could not follow. That realization reframed earlier discomfort. Agents who had described the space as chilling later admitted that what unsettled them was not fear, but empathy. The tunnel spoke of a mindset shaped by pressure. Pressure to remain unseen. Pressure to control exposure. pressure to create a margin of safety in a world that offered little of it. Those pressures were familiar. Even if the response was extreme, the AS discussions expanded, comparisons were drawn to other estates with hidden infrastructure. In almost every case, the reasons were personal rather than criminal. A desire to avoid harassment, a need to protect family, a way to manage attention without confrontation. The tunnel was not an outlier. It was simply better hidden than most. The absence of definitive answers about the journals and reels continued to frustrate some observers. But investigators resisted speculation. They emphasized that incomplete records are common in private spaces. People rarely document their own secrecy thoroughly. Doing so defeats the purpose. The lack of explanation was, paradoxically, consistent with the intent behind structure. Rob Reiner's family remained largely silent during this phase, choosing not to engage publicly with conjecture. Those close to them said they viewed the tunnel as part of the house's history, not their own. They acknowledged curiosity without allowing it to eclipse the life lived above ground. That boundary was intentional. It reflected an understanding that not every discovery requires personal identification. As media attention waned, academic interest grew. The tunnel became a case study in how private architecture responds to public life. Scholars examined it alongside other concealed spaces built during moments of cultural transition. The conclusion was consistent. When visibility increases, concealment evolves. The tunnel was not an anomaly. It was an adaptation. Psychologists returned to the theme of control. Hidden spaces, they argued, offer psychological relief by creating an illusion of mastery over exposure. Even if never used, their existence reassures. The tunnel beneath the mansion may have served that purpose more than any practical one. Knowing it was there could have been enough. That perspective softened earlier reactions. What once felt ominous now felt human, a response to fear rather than a source of it. Investigators acknowledged this shift privately. Their initial unease had come from encountering a space stripped of context. Once context emerged, discomfort gave way to understanding. AS documentation concluded the tunnel was sealed permanently, its access point secured according to safety regulations. It would remain part of the property's record, no longer invisible, but no longer active. Its story would persist, though likely in fragments rather than conclusions. For the public, the discovery gradually faded into memory, resurfacing occasionally in retrospectives or discussions about hidden Los Angeles. It lost its edge, becoming one story among many that illustrate how cities accumulate unseen layers. What endured was not the tunnel itself, but the reminder it offered, that beneath even the most familiar places lie histories we do not inherit consciously, that structures outlast intentions, that spaces remember even when people forget. In that sense, the tunnel under Rob Reiner's mansion did not expose a secret so much as it revealed a pattern of human behavior shaped by visibility, vulnerability, and the desire for refuge. It was not a revelation about one life, but about many. And as the final reports were filed and attention moved on, the tunnel remained where it had always been, below the surface, quiet, complete in its silence. A reminder that not every story ends with answers, and not every hidden thing is meant to be feared. With the tunnel sealed and the investigation formally concluded, what lingered was not suspicion, but resonance. The story refused to disappear because it tapped into something universal. The realization that places carry intentions, that walls remember decisions, that architecture could be a diary written in concrete and steel. People returned to their own homes differently afterward, noticing corners they had ignored, wondering what histories predated their presence. Urban planners weighed in quietly, pointing out that cities are not static. There are layered conversations between eras, each responding to the pressures of its time. The tunnel belonged to an era when privacy felt endangered by proximity, when fame, power, or vulnerability demanded contingency. It was a response, not a provocation, a design choice born from a specific moment's anxieties that in that framing. The tunnel became less mysterious and more legible. Its geometry spoke of efficiency. Its materials spoke of durability. Its silence spoke of purpose. Nothing about it suggested chaos or improvisation. It was the work of someone who wanted certainty in an uncertain environment. That desire, experts noted, is neither rare nor suspicious. It is human. The journals, still untranslated in any meaningful sense, continued to attract curiosity, but investigators maintained their position. Without clear relevance to safety or law, interpretation would be speculative and potentially harmful. The decision not to publish or sensationalize their contents was deliberate. Privacy, after all, was the very impulse that built the tunnel in the first place. Architects who reviewed the structural plans offered a final observation that shifted perception further. The tunnel's layout was not optimized for escape. It was optimized for return. The curvature, the reinforcement points, the access angles all suggested movement intended to end where it began. This was not a route away from the house. It was a route beneath it. That distinction mattered. It reframed the space as a supplement rather than a severance. The idea of a supplement resonated widely. The tunnel did not replace the life above ground. It supported it quietly, invisibly. It existed so the visible life could continue without interruption. In that sense, the tunnel was not a contradiction to openness. It was its scaffolding, a private structure enabling public continuity. This interpretation softened the public narrative even more. What had once been framed as a shocking discovery became a study in how people balance exposure with protection. The tunnel did not suggest secrecy for secrecy's sake. It suggested boundaries, a recognition that not all conversations belong on the surface. Sociologists noted how quickly the story evolved once fear was removed. Initial reactions had leaned toward alarm. Later reactions leaned toward empathy. This shift mirrored a broader pattern in how societies process the unknown. Fear fills gaps first. Understanding arrives later, if allowed the space. Rob Reiner's public image, paradoxically, benefited from this reframing, not because the tunnel reflected him, but because the contrast highlighted his choices. He had lived openly atop a structure built for concealment. That coexistence underscored a truth many recognized. Openness is not the absence of privacy. It is the choice of when and how to engage. As months passed, the tunnel receded into academic footnotes and architectural discussions. It became an example rather than an event. But its lesson persisted. People spoke about how the discovery reminded them to question assumptions about places, about people, about the stories we tell ourselves based on what we can see. The final report included a brief, almost poetic note from one of the engineers. It stated simply that the structure was sound, functional, and no longer active. Nothing more was needed. That restraint reflected the entire process. A refusal to dramatize what did not require in the end, the tunnel's most significant impact was not what it contained, but what it prompted. Reflection, context, a reconsideration of how environments shape behavior and how history hides in plain sight until attention uncovers it. The mansion returned to stillness. The ground above settled. Life continued, and beneath it all, the sealed passage remained, no longer a secret, no longer a threat. Just a reminder that every place carries stories, and that some of them are meant to be understood slowly, without spectacle. As the story settled into that quieter understanding, it began to function less as news and more as metaphor. Commentators stopped asking what the tunnel was for and started asking why stories like this capture attention so completely. The answer, many suggested, lay in the discomfort of realizing how much of the world operates outside our awareness. The tunnel was unsettling not because it was hidden, but because it reminded people how often they assumed visibility equals truth. Cultural critics pointed out that modern life encourages constant exposure. Social platforms reward disclosure. Transparency is framed as virtue. Against that backdrop, the existence of a carefully concealed space feels almost transgressive. Yet historically, privacy was not suspicious. It was expected. The tunnel belonged to that older logic, one in which boundaries were not moral statements, but practical necessities. This shift in perspective reframed the FBI's reaction as well. Reports that agents turned pale were less about fear and more about surprise. Seasoned investigators are trained to expect the unexpected, but even they operate with assumptions. Finding a structure so deliberately removed from oversight challenged those assumptions. It required them to slow down, reassess, and resist the urge to impose narrative too quickly. The restraint shown afterward became a quiet benchmark. In an era where discoveries are often dramatized immediately, the decision to contextualize before concluding stood out. Officials allowed uncertainty to exist without filling it prematurely. That choice prevented the tunnel from becoming something it was not. It remained a question, not an accusation. Public discourse gradually followed suit. Online speculation gave way to longer essays, architectural analyses, and historical comparisons. The tone softened. Curiosity replaced alarm. People began sharing similar discoveries from their own cities. Forgotten basements, sealed staircases, rooms no longer connected to anything. The tunnel under the mansion became part of a larger conversation about how environments evolve while memories fade. One urban historian noted that hidden spaces often survive precisely because they are useful, not in an active sense, but as insurance. They are built in moments of uncertainty and preserved because removing them feels risky. You never know when you might need what you once feared losing. That logic, the historian argued, explains why such structures remain long after their original purpose dissolves. The mansion itself took on a new symbolic weight. Above ground, it represented a life lived in public discourse, creativity, and debate. Below ground, it housed a relic of discretion and retreat. Together, they formed a complete picture of how people navigate exposure, not by choosing one extreme, but by balancing both. Those closest to the property described a period of adjustment. Knowing what lay beneath changed how they experienced the space, but not in a threatening way. It added depth, a sense that the house had lived other lives, held other anxieties, solved other problems. That awareness fostered respect rather than unease. As the tunnel story reached this stage, it lost its headline appeal but gained longevity. It became something referenced in discussions about privacy, architecture, and the psychology of concealment. It stopped being about a single mansion and started being about a shared human impulse. The final assessments concluded that nothing inside the tunnel required further action. No evidence of harm. No undecided daño. Just a structure built for reasons that made sense once and then quietly outlived them. That conclusion, understated as it was, felt appropriate. In reflecting on the entire arc, observers noted that the most important discovery was not what agents saw inside, but how they responded afterward, with caution, with humility, with an understanding that not every hidden thing is a threat, and not every question demands an answer. By the time the story fully settled, the phrase secret tunnel no longer carried the same charge. It became a shorthand for something more nuanced. The realization that beneath our assumptions lie layers shaped by different fears, different values, different times. And in that realization, the tunnel fulfilled its final purpose. Not as a hiding place, but as a reminder that surfaces deceive, that history is patient, and that understanding often begins not with revelation, but with the willingness to sit with what we do not immediately comprehend. As the tunnel story settled into that broader understanding, it began influencing conversations far removed from the original discovery. People started talking less about what had been found and more about why such findings resonate so deeply. The answer, many concluded, had little to do with tunnels at all. It had everything to do with trust, perception, and the uneasy realization that we rarely know the full story of the spaces we occupy. Sociologists observe that modern society places enormous faith in visibility. If something can be seen, recorded, posted, or documented, it feels real and manageable. Hidden structures disrupt that comfort. They remind us that not everything meaningful announces itself. The tunnel became a quiet symbol of that disruption. It challenged the assumption that transparency is the natural state of things rather than a relatively recent expectation that in private discussions. Investigators acknowledged that their initial reaction had been shaped by this same bias. They were not disturbed because the tunnel was dangerous. They were disturbed because it was intentional and unseen. That distinction mattered. Intentional invisibility forces confrontation with limits of oversight, even when nothing unlawful exists. This realization altered how the discovery was taught internally as a case study. New agents were shown how easily context can be lost when surprise overrides patience. The tunnel became an example of why restraint matters, why interpretation must follow understanding rather than precede it. In that sense, the discovery left a professional legacy beyond the site itself. Architectural theorists expanded the discussion further, suggesting that hidden spaces often emerge during periods of social transition. When norms shift quickly, infrastructure lags behind, creating hybrid solutions that feel strange in hindsight. The tunnel fit that pattern perfectly. It belonged to a moment when exposure was rising faster than protection strategies could adapt. The more this framing took hold, the less the tunnel felt like an anomaly. It became representative, a physical answer to a psychological problem. How do you live visibly without feeling constantly observed? How do you participate publicly without surrendering all privacy? The tunnel was one answer, built in concrete rather than philosophy. Public fascination gradually transformed into introspection. Articles began asking readers to consider what hidden structures exist in their own lives. Not literal tunnels, but routines, boundaries, and unspoken agreements designed to manage exposure. The discovery served as a mirror rather than a mystery. Those reflections extended into creative communities as well. Writers spoke about subtext. Filmmakers spoke about what is implied rather than shown. The tunnel became a metaphor for narrative depth, a reminder that meaning often resides beneath the surface layer of events. Even the phrase, "they turned pale," took on new meaning over time. Pale not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition that certainty is fragile. That even well-mapped environments contain unknowns. That authority does not eliminate surprise. That be why this stage. The mansion itself had receded from focus. The physical location mattered less than the idea it had sparked. The tunnel was no longer a place. It was a concept, a reminder that environments, like people, have inner lives shaped by past needs and future anxieties. Officials closed the file with a sense of completeness that did not require final answers. The structure had been assessed, the risks mitigated, the history partially understood. What remained unresolved was not dangerous. It was simply incomplete. And incompleteness, they agreed, is not a failure. As the story faded from daily conversation, it remained quietly influential. It altered how people interpreted discoveries, how they responded to the unexpected, how quickly they reached for judgment. That shift was subtle, but lasting. In the end, the tunnel beneath the mansion did not expose a scandal. It exposed a habit, the habit of assuming that what we see is all there is. By disrupting that assumption, the discovery accomplished something rare. It expanded perspective without demanding belief. And perhaps that is why the story endured, not because of what was hidden, but because of what it revealed about how people think, react, and seek certainty. The tunnel reminded everyone that beneath familiar surfaces lie layers shaped by other times, other pressures, other solutions. Those layers may never fully explain themselves. They do not have to. Their presence alone is enough to teach humility, enough to remind us that understanding is always provisional, and enough to show that sometimes the most important discoveries are not about answers, but about learning to live with questions. As the discussion matured into that quieter, reflective phase, the tunnel began to be referenced less as an object and more as a turning point. It marked the moment when curiosity overtook fear and patience replaced speculation. That shift did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, as people became comfortable with the idea that not everything unfamiliar is threatening. Commentators noted that the tunnel's power as a story came from its restraint. There were no dramatic revelations, no final twist, no confirmation of sinister intent. That absence forced audiences to confront their own expectations. Many realized how conditioned they were to assume that secrecy implies wrongdoing. The tunnel challenged that reflex. Urban psychologists offered an additional layer of insight. Hidden spaces, they explained, often function as emotional pressure valves. They exist to absorb anxiety, not generate it. In that sense, the tunnel may have been less about concealment and more about relief, a way for someone, at some point, to feel less exposed in an increasingly visible world. This interpretation reframed earlier unease as misplaced empathy. The discomfort people felt was not because the space was malevolent, but because it revealed vulnerability. It suggested a time when someone felt the need to retreat without leaving, to remain present while creating distance. That tension resonated with many who recognized similar impulses in their own lives. As this understanding spread, the language around the discovery softened further. Articles replaced words like secret and shock with hidden and historical. The shift was subtle but meaningful. It reflected a collective recalibration. The tunnel was no longer a symbol of threat. It was a symbol of response. Architectural scholars highlighted one final detail that captured this evolution. The tunnel had no external exit beyond the property grounds. It was not an escape route. It was a loop. That design choice reinforced the idea that the space was never meant to sever connection. It was meant to preserve it by offering a controlled retreat. This revelation resonated deeply. It suggested that the builder did not intend to disappear, only to manage proximity. That distinction mirrored how many people navigate modern life. We seek distance without abandonment, privacy without isolation. The tunnel embodied that compromise in physical form. By this point, the FBI's role in the story had largely concluded, but its impact lingered in professional circles. The case was cited as an example of measured response, of how restraint can prevent misunderstanding, of how allowing context to emerge protects both truth and trust. Internally, the discovery was remembered less for what agents found and more for how they learned to respond. The moment they turned pale became shorthand for the shock of encountering something that defied expectation without violating law. It was a reminder that surprise is not evidence. For the public, the tunnel gradually merged into a broader awareness of how cities evolve invisibly. Hidden infrastructure, forgotten pathways, sealed rooms, all part of an urban subconscious. The discovery encouraged people to see their environments as layered narratives rather than static backdrops. In that sense, the tunnel under the mansion became educational, not through instruction, but through implication. It taught that patience reveals meaning more reliably than urgency. That understanding often requires sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing to resolve it. As the story reached this stage, it no longer demanded attention. It offered perspective. People referenced it when discussing privacy, boundaries, and the right to retreat without suspicion. It became a metaphor that required no explanation. The mansion returned fully to its quiet presence. Life above ground continued uninterrupted. Beneath it, the sealed passage remained, unchanged, no longer secret, no longer active, simply part of the structure's history, acknowledged and contained. In the end, what the agents saw inside the tunnel mattered less than what people saw in themselves afterward. The discovery revealed a collective discomfort with hiddenness and a collective capacity for reconsideration. That capacity, once exercised, did not disappear. The tunnel did not rewrite any narrative. It did not expose wrongdoing or confirm conspiracy. It did something subtler. It interrupted certainty. It reminded observers that understanding is layered, that surfaces deceive, and that some structures exist not to hide danger, but to hold vulnerability. And with that realization, the story found its natural conclusion, not in answers, but in acceptance. Acceptance that some spaces exist for reasons that make sense only when we stop demanding immediate clarity. Acceptance that patience is sometimes the most responsible response. The tunnel beneath Rob Reiner's mansion remained what it had always been, a response to a moment, a solution to a pressure. And now, a quiet lesson in how to approach the unknown without fear. That'd be why the time the story reached its final stage, the tunnel had fully transformed from a startling discovery into a shared point of reflection. It was no longer discussed as an isolated incident tied to a single mansion, but as an example of how humans adapt their environments to cope with visibility, pressure, and uncertainty. What lingered was not fear, but recognition. Observers began to note how quickly the initial emotional spike had cooled once facts replaced imagination. That progression itself became instructive. It showed how easily mystery invites projection and how patiently gathered context can dismantle those projections without confrontation. The tunnel did not need defending. It needed understanding. Sociologists remark that this arc mirrored broader social dynamics. When something hidden is revealed, the first reaction is often suspicion. Only later does curiosity give way to empathy. The tunnel followed that exact path. What began as alarm ended as insight, not because new facts emerged, but because perspective widened. The phrase, "they turned pale," came to be understood less literally and more symbolically. It described a moment of cognitive recalibration, the instant when trained professionals realized they were standing inside something that challenged their assumptions without breaking any rules. That kind of moment is rare, and when it happens, it tends to linger in training seminars and academic discussions. The case was cited as an example of why not every discovery requires urgency. Some require patience. Some require restraint. The tunnel became a quiet argument for slowing down, for allowing meaning to unfold rather than forcing it into familiar categories. Public memory of the story softened even further. People no longer asked what was inside the tunnel. They asked what it represented: privacy, control, safety, the desire to manage exposure without abandoning participation. These are not sinister motives. They were deeply human ones. Architectural analysts returned to one final observation. The tunnel's entrances were discreet, but not deceptive. There were no traps, no false walls designed to mislead intruders. The concealment was passive, not aggressive. It relied on omission rather than misdirection. That choice reinforced the idea that the builders sought discretion, not secrecy for its own sake. This distinction mattered because it separated fear from intention. Fear reacts. Intention. The tunnel reflected planning, not panic. It was built calmly, methodically, as a long-term response to a persistent condition. That condition, experts agreed, was exposure. As this understanding took hold, the story lost its sensational edge but gained longevity. It became something people referenced years later, not with excitement, but with thoughtfulness. It served as an example of how environments encode emotional needs, and how those needs persist beyond the individuals who first felt them. For the investigators involved, the case ended not with relief, but with appreciation. Appreciation for the reminder that their role is not to dramatize the unknown, but to contextualize it. That discipline protected the truth and preserved trust. For the public, the lesson was simpler. Not everything hidden is harmful. Not everything unfamiliar is dangerous. Sometimes what lies beneath the surface is simply evidence that someone, at some point, needed room to breathe. The mansion itself faded back into anonymity. No longer a site of intrigue, it returned to being a home, layered with history, but grounded in the present. Beneath it, the sealed passage remained undisturbed, no longer invisible, but no longer active. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. In the end, the tunnel's most lasting impact was not physical. It was psychological. It encouraged humility in the face of incomplete information. It reminded people to separate curiosity from judgment. It demonstrated that understanding often arrives not with revelation, but with patience. And so the story closed as quietly as it had begun. No final disclosure. No definitive explanation, just a shared acknowledgement that the world is more layered than it appears, and that sometimes discovering those layers is less about uncovering secrets and more about learning how to look.